What's up, horror fans? Danny here from the Lasercast, and I'm back in my living room with my horror shelves behind me outside of my classroom where I filmed my Chucky review the other day. And it's Saturday morning, so I'm here to talk to you about episode 4 of Queer for Fear, and this is the last episode in the series. And before I even go into this episode, season 2, please, because I loved this series so much. There is so much in this 4-part series that I feel I can take into my classroom, and not to be a woke liberal and change the curriculum, but like to talk about women's rights and LGBTQ rights, and I teach a criminal justice class, and the way that homosexuality and that identity and queerness had been criminalized very often. They talked about that in episode 3. There's so much more. They could do an entire episode about Clive Barker. They could do a career retrospective of Clive Barker. They could focus on the Chucky franchise and Don Mancini. There's so much more that I would love to see get explored in a second season. So please, Shudder, greenlight it. Let's go. Let's do it again. This is one of the best things that Shudder has. And Shudder has a ton of great stuff, by the way. Last night, Joe Bob had his Haunted Halloween hangout. Him and Darcy welcomed Elvira. Speaking of queerness and horror, Elvira, of course, has recently come out, and they were watching Elvira's Haunted Hills, which is a typically silly Elvira movie. And then one of my favorites, a movie that when I saw it for the first time, I went out and bought it on Blu-ray, Popcorn from 1991, which they love to describe as the first and only horror film filmed in Jamaica. Also on Shudder, Pete and I have been counting down the 101 scariest horror movie moments. The final episode, the top 10, is Wednesday. Come here to the Lasercast at 5 o'clock on Wednesday Eastern Time. We are going to be recording the countdown of Shudder's top 10, and then we're each going to give our top 10 from the list of 101, what our top 10 scariest horror movie moments of all time are. So let's get into Queer for Fear. Also, before we get into it, I mentioned Don Mancini, I mentioned Chucky, my review of Chucky, episode 3, all 3 episodes so far of season 2, reviews are up on the channel. Let's get into this episode, directed by Sam Weinman. This whole episode is about women throughout the history of horror, or the history of film, really, and how they've, basically women trying to control their sexuality, and how lesbian characters have been shown on screen, going all the way back to the dawn of cinema and into, of course, that early 30s period. The first film that they really focus on is Dracula's Daughter, a movie that I have not seen yet, but I believe is streaming on Peacock. Peacock has a fantastic Halloween section now, including tons of the classic Universal horror films and some of those film sequels like Dracula's Daughter. And they talk about how that was made at almost the same time as the Hays Code was put in, and the rule was, under the Hays Code, if you were going to show homosexuality, that the evil homosexual had to be killed at the end or had to be villainized. They reference 2 of the, I guess, linchpins or benchmarks of all lesbian horror cinema, being the Carmilla story and the Elizabeth Bathory legend, and how most of the lesbian horror tropes, especially lesbian vampire tropes, which they spend a lot of time this episode talking about, come from those 2 specific stories. When they're doing the part about Dracula's Daughter, B.J. Colangelo, who is one of the talking heads here, she mentions how in the 1930s, a lot of the treatment or the psychotherapy or the psychology that was used to treat the illness of homosexuality was a lot of what we would consider today conversion therapy. And that leads into this really kind of humbling conversation with Misha Asherovich, an actor from Freaky, who talked about how he was sent to a conversion therapy camp in the desert when he was younger. And he talks about how it was, as close to a real life, I believe his words were, as close to a real life horror film as you could possibly get. So it real interesting, again, and they brought this up in episode 3, how queerness in cinema and the handling of queerness in cinema kind of reflects the medical views of queerness and homosexuality as time has gone on. And they spend a lot of time talking about that post-Hays, post-World War II period, 40s and 50s, where a lot of the lesbian cinema in horror was done on like the invisible ghost tropes or haunted house movies, where there was always this specter of a woman hanging over the other women. And 2 of the films they referenced specifically were The Uninvited and The Haunting, a film that they have showed numerous clips from across this whole series. Phenomenal movie. If you have not ever seen it, is the original Cat People from the early 1940s. That Shudder had put that on not that long ago. It's not on there anymore, I think, but if you get a chance to see the original Cat People, fantastic movie. And then we do this like drastic switch from these like repressed, invisible lesbian ghost stories of the 40s to the hyper-sexualized lesbian vampire films of the late 60s and early 70s, mostly put out a combination of French filmmakers, kind of the sleaze world of Jess Franco, and then, of course, Hammer Studios. You get films like Vampiros Lesbos, and then one of the ones that they bring up, another phenomenal horror film, is Daughters of Darkness. If you look above my shoulder, up there, where my finger's pointing, I have a book, small little book called The 101 Horror Movies You Need to See Before You Die, and Daughters of Darkness was in there, and that's what led me to see that movie a couple of years ago, and it's fantastic. And they talk about how, while it is, I guess, a part of this kind of sleazy, sexualized lesbian vampire craze, it does something different, and it kind of, yes, the evil lesbian vampire is killed at the end. They also do something a little bit different with it, and it kind of elevates it, which it's a great film. And again, this is where me as the history teacher, they reference that these movies were coming out at a time where in America, we were trying to pass an equal rights amendment. Consider this for a second. Here in America, we rejected an amendment called Equal Rights Amendment, which would have basically leveled the playing field between the genders in 1972. I think it failed to pass by like 2 or 3 states. And, they play this newsreel footage of, them talking about how the ERA, if it had passed, it would have destroyed the family values of the home and the traditional gender roles, and it would have led to increases in homosexuality, which, by the way, they referenced how World War II led to a kind of a subtle increase in homosexuality because so many men had went off to war. And then we get into the 80s, a lot of discussion about The Hunger, about Vamp, with Grace Jones, and how that movie tied sex work and sexuality and queerness and race all together. And they play clips of Grace Jones doing interviews about her own sexuality. And then they get into an era that I'm very familiar with because of my age, and that is the 90s lesbian chic phase, where, and again, I was born in 82, so mid-90s is my you know, that's my era. That's like me coming of age, junior high and high school. I worked at the movie theater. So movies like Cruel Intentions, Wild Things, Bound, those were the movies I saw over and over and over again, thanks to the video store, thanks to working in the movie theater. And a lot of boys and a lot of kids my age used to love going and just catching that one scene in Cruel Intentions where Sarah Michelle Gellar kisses Selma Blair. And then, of course, you have the sex scenes in Wild Things, and Basic Instinct is talked about a lot, about how you have these bisexual characters, and the villains in the movie are these bisexual women. They don't even mention Jean Triplehorn's character, who turns out to be the villain in the movie at the end. But yeah, they reference how like sexuality and bisexuality in that movie was used to, you know, lure people in. And a lot of these movies, from those sexualized 70s vampire movies to this 90s lesbian chic phase, most of these movies are not written, they are not directed, and they do not star women, lesbian women. They're almost all directed by men. And then they reference, of course, the movie that really broke that was Bound, which was directed by the Wachowskis. And they have a lot of the talking heads talk about how did Bound, directed by two men, how did it get so much of it right? Of course, what do we know now is the Wachowskis are now trans women, and so their queerness allowed them, I guess, a better insight into that community, and how Bound also really, it's one of the first times where openly gay characters not only survive the whole movie, but they win. They kill the bad guy, they're the heroes, they get away together holding hands and with all the money. So it's like this celebration almost. And I mean, just think about what I've talked about in the last 10 minutes. We're talking about like the dawn of cinema in the early 1900s. We're talking about Dracula's Daughter, which is a universal horror film. We're talking about the films of the 40s. We're talking about the 60s and 70s, 80s and 90s, up until today. This one episode covered 100 years, pretty much, of history about the women in horror and lesbians in horror, and just so much intriguing stuff. And you're hearing from these incredible talking heads, filmmakers, writers, historians, critics, who they, you know, and they're adding their personal, like, how these movies affected them. One of the women mentions how when she saw, I forgot what movie, Mulholland Drive. She said that when she saw Mulholland Drive in 2001 or 2 when it came out, she said she walked out of the movie as a 20-year-old and she knew she was a lesbian. But then she didn't come out for another, 13, 14 years. And that idea is always present in this, where the talking heads refer to how these movies help them and helped closeted people deal with their sexuality, and struggle, get through those struggles. Just a phenomenal series. Please, Shudder, give us a season 2. Give us a season 2 of this. I'd be so intrigued to see more. And if you want to see more of the Lassercast, please subscribe. 101 Scariest Horror Movie Moments, Chucky, Season 2. This is the end of Queer for Fear, but Shudder has a ton of stuff out there. If you want to see Pete and my review of Halloween Ends and Hellraiser, we were joined by several great horror writers for a discussion. We interviewed our friend, director David Weiner, about the upcoming In Search of Darkness Part 3, which you can go to 80shorrordoc.com and support up until Halloween. So we're going to keep pumping out the content for you this October and beyond. So if you enjoy it, let me know. What did you think of Queer for Fear? What do you want to see in Season 2 if they come out with a Season 2 of Queer for Fear? Because I think there's so much more to talk about. This has been Danny from the Lassercast, and I'll see you very soon.